If you were sick, the establishment was geared towards finding cures,
Right.
as opposed to keeping you
Prevention.
well, and prevention. And so there's no one part of our economy or our society that we can blame for the changing eating patterns that we're in.
It's my pleasure to welcome former Congressman and Secretary Dan Glickman. He's the former U.S. Secretary of Agriculture under President Bill Clinton, U.S. House of Representative representing the 4th Congressional District of Kansas, Chairman and CEO of the Motion Picture Association of America, otherwise known as the MPAA, and former VP and Executive Director at the Aspen Institute. I used to be a member of the Aspen Institute. And he's currently Senior Counselor at APCO Worldwide and author of the book Laughing at Myself, My Education in Congress, on the Farm, and at the Movies. Dan, welcome. How are you?
I'm doing great. It's a long introduction, but now
It sure is, but you've got a long resume, my friend.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, it's great to have you. I don't know where to start. I want to start with this one because I think it's just interesting to a lot of people. The Motion Picture Association of America, okay, and we'll get into some heavier stuff in a moment here, but there have been many controversies with your predecessor, Jack Valente, and so forth, and I never really had time to follow those or understand what they were all about. Can you enlighten us into some of that history? I think it's probably pretty fascinating to a lot of people.
Well, I mean, I would like to tell you that I was a colleague to the stars, and I knew a lot of people in the actual acting business, but that's not true. I was basically the chief lobbyist for the industry when it came to intellectual property issues and tax and trade issues, and also ran the rating system, PG, PG-13, R, those things. And I mean, actually, there wasn't that much controversy. I mean, there was some controversy. A lot of people didn't like the ratings that we would give, and they would think they were either too tough or too weak. And of course, the big issue was folks who would steal intellectual property and, for a profit and stream stuff online without compensating for it. But by and large, most people know the MPAA through our rating system.
That's really what I was going to ask you about, the rating system. And I've heard complaints that, movies will get a more adult rating, I guess I should say, like an R rating, when and that's a way to reduce the viewership? Is that what happens? Is that the complaint people are making?
Yeah, when something's R rating, it basically it's an age-related thing. So,
well, I mean, I know what the rating is.
Yeah, okay.
I definitely understand that.
And so the idea is that there are certain movies that are not appropriate for children. That's the bottom line. And so the issue is, what would an average parent think when they would see this movie in terms of whether it's appropriate for children? And then you have a group of raters that rate every movie using that standard. And so some people think that there's too many movies that are rated less than R, that are violent. And some people say that there are too many movies that have too much sexual conduct that are rated less than R. But by and large, I think the rating system works pretty well to advise parents. And now we have something called descriptors. So in addition to the rating, it will tell you why it's rated the way it is because of either too much violence,
sex, drugs, and rock and roll,
that kind of thing. So it works pretty well. And basically, I'm not aware of too much in recent years, too much controversy.
Mm-hmm. But, I think it even becomes a political issue where films that have a political skew to them, the complaint will be that, that didn't deserve an R rating and that limited the viewership. And you've heard this stuff, of course.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. Well, it's a judgment call. And these are raters that, by and large, are people who work there and have families, and either parents or grandparents that sit around and rate the movies basically on what they think. It's basically what a parent or a grandparent would think of as they rate the movie. So most of them are still rated for children and to try to be selective in terms of what kids should see. And yeah, it's an art and not a science, to be honest with you.
So, Dan, is the MPAA a secretive organization in any way? I've heard that it's like a star chamber, these ratings, and nobody knows why, and it's secret people doing the ratings and stuff.
Well, it's not secret, but it's more open now than it used to be,
Mhm.
and you can appeal the ratings if you don't like them, and there's an appeals process, and so the ratings have become much more democratized than they used to be. So it has got the process has become much more open in recent years.
Does the MPA just do movies, or are they involved in music and video games and those kinds of
No,
warnings?
the gaming industry and music have their own rating system, and so but it parallels what the MPA does.
Last question about this. What's it like around the world, if you know? Maybe you don't know, but do they rate movies in Europe? And I mean, I've seen movies in Europe, but I haven't paid attention to how that works.
Most countries have their own rating system. Some of them adopt the MPA model. Some of them have a model that's relatively similar to the MPA model. But yeah, there are rating systems in almost every country.
Yeah, very interesting. Good stuff. Well, hey, let's talk about the more important stuff maybe than the movies, although the movies are fun. Tell us a little bit about your background in government and compare and contrast it to what's going on today and some of your thoughts about it. Everybody's been talking a lot about Bill Gates buying all the farmland. I'd love to get your take on that.
Well, actually, Ted Turner was buying a lot of farmland before Bill Gates
I
did.
know. Yes,
Uh,
he's a
but
huge
but
landowner.
But I'm from Kansas. My parents were born in Kansas. My grandparents were Eastern European immigrants, came to Kansas, and then through a variety of openings, I ran for Congress back in 1976 and was a congressman for 18 years, and then became Secretary of Agriculture under Bill Clinton and served that for 6 years. Both of these were fascinating jobs. I was not a farmer nor involved in agriculture professionally most of my life. So this became kind of a new career for me. But I became well understanding of the importance of food and agriculture to the American economy, and it's actually one of the largest single parts of the American economy is the whole food and agriculture chain. And then, of course, I had that switch in my career where I went into the motion picture type of world. But I'd say my heart was in my agriculture job that I did for about 25 years.
Tell us about the role, though. Like, what were some of the experiences or the big pieces of legislation that happened under your watch?
Well, the first of all, in at the Department of Agriculture is very interesting because the largest part of the Department of Agriculture is the U.S. Forest Service, about 40,000 employees that are involved in protecting the environment and timber cutting and land conservation measures, and the biggest amount of money being spent are in our feeding programs. So the SNAP program, which is food stamps, school lunch, school meals, WIC, and then of course our farm programs, and then food safety related issues. So the Department of Agriculture had this very wide jurisdiction, and it was very controversial because food is something that people care a lot about, and in my book I talk about the fact that I was the most assaulted member of the cabinet, at least up to that time. People threw genetically modified organisms at me, and they threw tofu cream pies at me, and a lot of these people were food activists, but it was certainly a very entertaining experience.
Yeah, very interesting. So, what were their complaints, though? Why were they
Well,
throwing the
a
flag?
lot of people, not a lot of people, but there were some folks who felt that we should not have genetically engineered food, that we should have largely organic food only. There were a lot of folks that weren't very happy with scientific discoveries in food. They wanted to go back to maybe the way things were done 100 years
And,
ago or
and and
so.
most of these complaints are probably centered around one company, Monsanto, right?
Well, not anymore. It's almost all of agriculture is involved in scientific discoveries and new kinds of food. So Monsanto was an early one because they were one of the first to have genetically engineered seeds. But now all the seed companies, all the crop input companies, and all of agribusiness is involved in new technologies.
I'm also referring to Roundup though too, but go
Oh
ahead.
yeah, that's right. But that was an early one. But now you see it. It's ubiquitous in agriculture, and of course, people who don't want that can buy organic food, buying that with that little label USDA organic that allows them to be assured that they don't have GMOs in their food products.
Yeah. Well, organic and GMO are different though, right?
They are, but in order to be GMO, you have to basically be organic. It's not the reverse. And
Oh, got it. Okay. Okay.
but it's I'm using them in parallel.
Do you think people's concerns are warranted about GMO and organic versus pesticides?
Well, first of all, I think different strokes for different folks. There is certainly nothing wrong with eating organic, and I eat a lot of organic food. But the fact of the matter is that science has improved food safety, food quality for a couple hundred years. And right now we have all these problems with climate. And the biggest issue is water availability. And so there's a lot of scientific research that's going on so plants can use less water growing food. To do that, you need science to do that, and you may need new technologies to do that, and to deal with pests and disease, to feed a hungry world. And you really can't do that without using science. And so I think some of the opponents to that are naive, but it doesn't mean that there isn't a role for organic food as well.
Yeah. What about GMO?
Well, I mean, they kind of relate to the same thing. When we've been kind of modifying the genes of food for a long, long time, ever since Gregor Mendel began doing that. But what we haven't been doing until the last, I'd say 40 or 50 years of taking a gene from one species and putting it into another species.
Exactly what I was going to say. We may have, like in biology class, discovered how to make different colored roses, right, by blending them. But it wasn't taking fish genes and putting them into vegetables, right?
Yeah. I mean,
Or vice versa.
and of course now there's a new technology called CRISPR technology, which
Yeah.
is modifying
DNA
the
editing
genes,
software.
modifying the genes themselves rather than moving one gene into another. But if you look at the crises of the world, particularly the climate crises, there is no way that we can produce food that uses less water, less pesticides, deals with the challenges of climate without using some of these technologies. It just cannot be done.
Well, that's really interesting that you say that, because I want to just take you and the listeners back to maybe the mid to late 70s and just remember these apocalyptic movies that we used to see. I mean, you're a movie guy, right? Soylent Green, et cetera, et cetera. Most of them depicted food crises, food shortage, famine, and that didn't happen. And I'm wondering what you credit that. Is it the science that was brought into agriculture that prevented all of this stuff that might have happened, all this Malthusian apocalyptic type stuff that they were predicting?
Well, first of all, we're lucky in the United States and in the developed world where we don't have famine. But there is extensive famine and deep hunger in the developing world.
Sure.
And
these scenarios were depicted in the U.S. So
yeah, but anyway, agriculture is very productive. So, it used to be that half the people in this country were on farms and produced food for this country, and now it's about 1.5% that produce the same amount of food. And part of that is productivity, and it's based on good science. And there are downsides of this as well as upsides of this because
and some is just machinery, of course, too.
well, and we have a lot more consolidation in agriculture than we used to have. But by and large, we produce so much food in this country that we throw away about 30% of our food through food waste and of course we have to export a lot of our food overseas as well. So we are a land of plenty, and nobody in America should. There is hunger in America, but there isn't famine in America.
Well, I don't know. Did you answer that question
Yeah,
about the apocalyptic movies?
yeah. Well,
And
look. I mean, I know the good, the bad, and the ugly in Hollywood, and the apocalyptic movies that sells movies. There are a lot of different subjects. So,
well, there were also a lot of authors and things like that. It didn't just come in the movies.
I
But
mean, I think you can, if I just may say, I think you can make the case about nutrition
yeah,
and the quality of food of what we eat more than the volume of what we eat, the quantity. So we produce plenty of food. The question is, are we producing nutritious food? Or are we producing food that causes a lot of diseases like cardiovascular or diabetes or those kinds of things?
and
That's a
cancer. I
different.
was just going to go there with you as well. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, look, I think that we suffer from a lot of disease in this country. We spend more on treating type 2 diabetes than we spend on most of our Medicare programs. Much of type 2 diabetes is caused by lack of attention to exercise and food consumption, high carb food consumption. And, this is an issue that the schools are trying to deal with now, and the new Secretary of Agriculture is trying to deal with. And the food industry is actually catching on. How do you get people to eat better? Not just more, but better.
Yeah, sure. So the processed food is certainly a problem. I mean, it is just amazing how we have this obesity problem, and the health is just terrible. I mean, it's really incredible. It wasn't like that in the 80s, for example. I mean, I remember, and just look at the stats. It's off the charts. The diabetes, the obesity, et cetera, et cetera. What changed?
Well, I think part of it has to do with lifestyle changes. It's not just food. It's how we live, lack of exercise, the automobiles after the Second World War, where everybody had cars, and I mean, so it's a whole kind of voluminous issue of what our lifestyle is. But finally, and the medical profession, by the way, was much more focused on treatment than on prevention. And that had a lot to do with it as well. If you were lying down horizontally, that's where most of the resources went into, as opposed to standing up vertically.
Meaning,
Meaning
did you mean that the other way around? Did you mean to say?
I guess what I mean is that if you were sick, the establishment was geared towards finding cures,
Right.
as opposed to keeping
Prevention.
well, and prevention. And so there's no one part of our economy or our society that we can blame for the changing eating patterns that we're in.
I think we can largely blame Starbucks and Coca-Cola, though.
Uh,
After that, I'll take McDonald's, but Starbucks is really, really pretty bad. But yeah, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, as the saying goes. No question about it.
Sure.
Yeah, no question about it. So, I mean, I know Ted Turner's a huge landowner. Back to the Bill Gates thing. Is there anything behind that, or is it just what he's up to? No big deal. Like we should.
I don't talk to him. I really don't know him. So I would say that there's been a lot of consolidation in land ownership, and some degree in farmland ownership in America, particularly in grazing areas. There has not been what I call a huge amount of people buying massive amounts of tracts of land for agriculture purposes, because there's just not that much money to be made in traditional production agriculture. They may be buying it for conservation purposes. I suspect that Bill Gates is more interested in conservation than he actually is, rather than in producing or production agriculture.
Which concerns me too, because
Yeah.
if he takes some of that farmland out of production, then that would lead to more food inflation, which was the next question I had for you, Dan. Food prices have been skyrocketing lately, and for quite a while, we really enjoyed pretty cheap food. What do you say about food
Well,
inflation?
first of all, largely we still enjoy pretty cheap food in America.
Yeah,
And
comparatively, I agree.
people pay far less per unit of calorie in the U.S. than they do, for example, in Western Europe or another part, and certainly it's something that we should be proud of. But there's no question food prices have been going up the last year. Part of that is COVID related, is the supply chains for food were dramatically impacted by COVID.
Same with many supply chains, lumber,
Right.
automobiles, chips and
Yeah,
circuitry and
that's
all
right.
kinds of things.
That's
Yeah,
right.
but with, let's try and take COVID out of the equation. I mean, we have seen significant food inflation over the last decade. Do you attribute
Actually,
that to anything in particular?
actually not. That is, food prices are cyclical and have to do a lot with supply of food, natural disasters of food, but overall, food prices have still remained relatively low compared to energy prices and other things in our society. And I'm not saying that certainly in the last year we've seen an increase in food prices, particularly meat prices, but it's still we get a pretty good deal on the price of food in this country.
I would argue, though, that when you compare the U.S. to Europe, I mean, Europeans are eating better quality food, even though it is more expensive. There's no question about it, by and large.
Well, I mean, look, we do need to get people to eat more fresh fruits and vegetables, and we knew, the amount of fat and carbohydrates that go into our diet is, in large degree, I think it's impacted by marketing and advertising of food. I watch a lot of television, so I see what's advertised, and generally speaking, you don't see blueberries and strawberries
I know.
advertised on
Yeah.
TV.
You only see processed junk.
You tend to, and a lot of restaurant food that's advertised as well. But that's one of the reasons why one of my goals has been to get the medical profession much more interested in nutrition. The relationship between nutrition, agriculture, food, and health has been an unappreciated relationship up until the last couple of years.
Sure, sure. So let's talk about politics for a moment. I want to make sure we touch on this a little more before you go. What's the difference between today's political world and let's maybe take Trump out of it, because I know we could say a lot about that one. But just the way the political machine works in Washington today versus way back in the 90s under the Clinton era when you were there. What are some of the differences? I mean, is it really more divided now, or is that a perception we have? I mean, I certainly remember people on both sides of the aisle hating each other in the 90s.
Well, one, it's easy to be nostalgic because I don't know if you remember, but there were fist fights on the floor of the House back in the 19th century. There were Puerto Rican nationalists that shot up the House of Representatives with a little bit like the insurrection that we just saw.
Oh, much worse than that, I would say. I mean,
You
I
know,
was looking at some pictures of that after it happened. Yeah.
but I would have to say the atmosphere is much more toxic than it used to be, and the ability of people to get along across the aisle is much more difficult, and I think that's caused by a lot of factors. I think it has to do with the amount of money in politics, which has metastasized dramatically in
Oh,
the
it's
last 30,
sickening.
40
Yeah.
years. And then, it also has to do with the nature of our media today. It's the instantaneity of information and how bad information can travel just as fast as good information can travel. And we've become much more tribal. So you're either on the left or on the right, and very few. It's harder to get people to get to the middle, and the middle is where public policy is made, not on the edges. I compare it to a football analogy. Between the 40-yard line and the 40-yard line is where most good policy is made, and good public policy is not made between the end zone and the 20-yard line on either one side or the other.
Yeah. It's interesting because as you mentioned, the media is much more fragmented now than it used to be, although it's now, I would argue, getting more consolidated again with these tech companies working in lockstep with each other and, doing what they do. They really are the media. But, about maybe 1999 or so, I started thinking this thought, Dan, that's I think a lot of really what you're saying, and it's that with the internet and the availability of so many additional media choices, back when the cable channels went to hundreds of channels, right, versus we had a few networks in the old days, the world today is just enabling people to become more like themselves. because we all really do live in an echo chamber where the content is fed to us based on what we like, what our preferences are. And so, if you're a liberal, you're going to see liberal stuff. If you're a conservative, you're going to see conservative stuff, and you're not going to see the other side of the stuff. There's no more, Harry Reasoner,
Yeah, well, I agree with you on that, and I think that we're not going to probably change this fragmentation of the media, but what we do have to do is try to educate people, especially at a younger age, as to question facts and not just accept things that they hear, whether it's on television. And one of the things that I've thought we ought to do is require much more civic education in high schools, and so that people who are going to school learn more about the nature of the world and more discriminating in terms of their understanding of facts. And that's a problem. I remember Jay Leno, the guy, used to have this thing on TV called jaywalking, and he'd go up to people on the street and he'd say
they didn't know anything.
They didn't know anything, who the president of the United States was, and they'd say Albert Schweitzer or something like that.
Right.
And now I don't know if that was a show or not. I don't know how truthful.
Oh, some of it's real, I'm sure.
But it did strike me that when you don't really know how your government works, you're much more susceptible to the fragmentation of the media.
Yeah, very interesting. What else do you want people to know? Maybe anything I haven't asked you, Dan.
I think the thing that probably troubles me the most, and I wasn't in Congress when this happened, of course, but this insurrection that happened in January was really disturbing to me because just imagine, it was almost like the French Revolution was coming to our capital, and people busting down the doors of the Capitol, frankly, on the belief that the election was stolen from Donald Trump. And back in my career, I've seen the evolution of democracy, that it would become just a much more toxic society politically. And it's one of the things I'm trying to work on in my waning years, in terms of trying to work on those things that help people want to reestablish the strengths of our democracy.
I want to play devil's advocate with you on that point for a moment. So, I don't know, this may sound like a tremendously crazy question, but what's wrong with a revolution? I mean,
well, of course, Jefferson
we look at the American Revolution, and nobody says that was bad.
Well,
right?
Of course, Jefferson said every revolution every once in a while is a good thing. So that veterans is what you're saying. But we have a democratic process to try to resolve conflict. And as long as people believe that the democratic process is on the level and we can get our voices heard and we listen to each other, then we compromise and we go forward and make choices. And that's what a democracy is all about. The question is...
And that's ideal, but some people obviously don't believe that.
I know, but a revolution is often fought by people who have such extreme views that they don't accept the other person's point of view. My mother used to say, you have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a simple reason. You're supposed to listen twice as much as you talk, because you might actually learn something from the other person. And you might actually be a more productive citizen. When I was a freshman member of Congress in 1977, Hubert Humphrey, you remember him? He was former vice president of the United States.
Vaguely, yeah.
Okay, all right. Well, he was.
That's the preamble to All in the Family. Hubert Humphrey. Well, anyway, again.
He spoke to the House of Representatives, and he said this advice. He said, fight every battle, legislative battle, like it was the most important battle of your life. But after it's over, go up to your opponent, not your enemy, to your opponent. Yeah. Shake hands with that person, because you're going to need them on the next issue that you face.
Right.
And that's the fundamental issue that we've got to deal with, is not thinking that the other guy is our enemy, but we have different points of view.
Right. And, frankly, I don't know if you love him or hate him. I mean, you worked for a Democrat administration, so I'm guessing you probably don't like him. But Reagan was very good at that.
Well,
he reached across the aisle very well.
Well, and also, I think George W. Bush, I admired him for, I didn't like the Iraq War, but I admired him for, he did a lot of very important things in terms of dealing with AIDS and malaria and those kinds of things. So I came from Kansas. Kansas is a state that's not known for electing a lot of Democrats. So for me to be successful, I had to be able to work across the aisle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Interesting. Well, thank you for joining us today. Really interesting talk, and what a variety of issues. We went from the motion picture world to farming to politics and everything in between. So that was very interesting, Dan.
Well, I can probably think of other subjects. I know a little about airplanes and airlines. Sure. And if you ever want to talk about other things, just call me up. Okay.
Sounds good. Sounds good. And of course, the book is available in all the usual places. And do you have a website you want to give out?
I don't have a website right now, but it's available either on Amazon, of course, or the University of Kansas Press is the publisher of the book.
You know, chapter 2 is entitled "The Most Powerful Man on Earth." Who is that? Who are you referring to?
That was, for a very short time in the world, me. I was the designated survivors. Remember the ABC?
Oh, yes, I watched the show.
Kiefer Sutherland. Okay, well, I was that odd person out during one of the States of the Union, and I had to leave Washington while President Clinton gave his speech and went to my daughter's apartment in New York. And I was accompanied by Secret Service and the military guy. I think he had the code with him. I don't know what I would have done if something would have happened. And then after it was over, the security left me. I took my daughter out to dinner that night. There was a blinding sleet storm. We were in New York, and we went outside. There was no such thing as Uber or Lyft. We couldn't get a cab. We walked 13 blocks back to her apartment, and I told her, I said, 3 hours ago, I was conceivably the most powerful man on the...
And now you're walking in sleet and snow.
I couldn't even get a cab, and it just shows you how the world changes.
Well, you should have gotten the Secret Service to give you a ride.
Well, they had left already because, you see, once the president got back at his house,
they didn't care about you.
They didn't care about me anymore.
Were you the designated survivor only one time? What is that, like a lottery process or something?
Yeah, basically, they never have the Secretary of State or Secretary of Defense. They always have them in the House chamber. So they pick people like the Secretary of Agriculture, Secretary of Interior, Secretary of Commerce. I told people the Secretary of Agriculture, they chose me because that was the most important department, because if you couldn't eat, then there was no reason to have a country anymore. But people didn't totally believe me.
Yeah. Well, I believe it. That's very important stuff. Dan Glickman, thanks so much for joining us.
You're welcome. Thank you. Appreciate it.